Part 1. In service to the great house. The world below stairs, a house divided by rank in Tudor England. The grandeur of a nobleman's household was not merely a reflection of his wealth, it was a living, breathing machine of status, power and relentless labor. Beneath the carved oak panels and tapestries of the great halls, beneath the clatter of silver goblets and lute music, lay another world, one hidden in plain sight. This was the world of servants, a hierarchy as rigid and unforgiving as that of the realm itself. To serve in a Tudor great house was both an opportunity and a trap. For many young men and women of yeoman stock, entering service promised a chance at advancement, a stable livelihood, and the hope of learning skills that might one day secure a better life. Yet, for most, it was a life of ceaseless toil, stifling obedience, and an existence measured not in coin or comfort, but in the will of those above them. The path to servitude, the journey into service, often began in childhood. Rural families, struggling to feed a half-dozen mouths, would send their eldest son or daughter to serve in a neighboring household by the age of 12 or 13. Many a boy might be scrubbing trenches in a manor kitchen, or a girl mending linens under the stern eye of a housekeeper. This was no casual arrangement. Service was a contract, sealed in trust, wages, and often legal obligation. In the household of a wealthy Tudor noble, the number of servants could be staggering. Dozens might work in a single establishment: cooks, scullions, laundresses, butlers, grooms, pages, ladies-in-waiting and stewards, each with defined roles and ranks. The higher one's station in this invisible ladder, the closer one stood to the lord or lady themselves, and thus the more valuable and more dangerous the position became. The kitchen inferno. The beating heart of any Tudor estate was its kitchen. To step inside was to enter a world of smoke, fire, and unending heat. Great open hearths blazed from dawn till long after dusk, roasting carcasses of mutton, beef, or venison. Cooks shouted over the din of cleavers striking wooden blocks. Scullions, the lowest of the low, hauled water, scrubbed pots, and endured the constant threat of burns, cuts, and the wrath of their superiors. The kitchen was a place of survival rather than romance. Food was plentiful here, but seldom enjoyed by those who prepared it. Servants dined on coarse bread pottage and the leftovers deemed unfit for the high table. A scullion might spend a decade in backbreaking labor before ever being considered for promotion, and many never escaped the kitchen at all. Life above the stairs, but not too high for those fortunate enough to serve in roles closer to their masters' ladies' maids, valets, or personal attendants. The pressures were different but no less intense. Proximity to power meant proximity to scandal, intrigue, and peril. A misplaced word could end a career. A botched task, spilling wine on a lord's doublet, failing to lace a gown properly, might bring not only dismissal but also ruin to one's family reputation. Ladies-in-waiting, often drawn from lesser gentry, were expected to be not just companions but political instruments. They listened, observed, and sometimes spied for their mistresses. Valets and gentlemen ushers managed clothing, personal effects, and the public image of their masters, tasks that demanded near-perfect execution. The tyranny of time. Tudor servants lived by the bell. Every hour was regimented: the dawn ringing of the kitchen bell, the summons to the great hall for meals, the tolling of curfew. There was little room for leisure. Most worked from before sunrise to long past nightfall. Even sleep was often a luxury, stolen in cramped quarters shared with others, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies. Rewards and punishments. Service held the faint glimmer of reward. A loyal steward might be granted land. A favored maid might marry well with her mistress's blessing. But such stories were the exception. Far more common were tales of beatings, dismissal, or lives spent in anonymous drudgery. Wages were meager, often supplemented with livery, clothing, or meals rather than coin. Many servants, upon old age or illness, found themselves turned out, with no pension or provision, left to beg or rely on family charity. A world of contradictions to modern eyes. The Tudor servant's life may seem unbearably harsh, but to the people of the time, it was simply the way of the world. Service was both a burden and a lifeline, a system that kept the wheels of aristocratic splendor turning. Without these unseen hands, the pageantry of the Tudor court and country house could not have existed. Yet, as we shall see in the next part, beneath this rigid order simmered unrest, ambition, and a slow, grinding struggle for dignity, a struggle that would shape not only the lives of servants, but the society they sustained. Part 2. Chains and chances. Discipline, opportunity, and resistance in Tudor service. If Part 1 revealed the sheer physical and emotional weight of daily life as a Tudor servant, Part 2 uncovers the world of rules, punishments, fleeting opportunities, and the subtle acts of defiance that shaped their lives. For in service, one was both trapped and sometimes given the slimmest chance to rise. But the price of stepping out of line could be deadly. 1. The laws of the house. Written and unwritten, every Tudor household was a world unto itself, with its own hierarchy, customs, and invisible codes. While the king's laws might rule the land within the walls of a noble's manor or a wealthy merchant's townhouse, the master's word was absolute. Servants lived under a strict regimen of order, enforced by custom as much as by direct command. Written rules existed in the grander households, formal household ordinances that outlined everything from the serving of meals to the locking of doors at night. They described in meticulous detail who was to rise when, where each servant must stand during dinner service, and how food should be tasted before being served to avoid poisoning the Lord. But beyond these were unwritten laws, rules of deference, of silence, of invisible lines never to be crossed. A servant must never contradict a master in public. They must avert their eyes when a noble passed. They must, above all, know their place. One wrong glance, one perceived insolence could see a servant whipped, dismissed, or worse. This hierarchy was not merely social, it was spiritual. The Tudor worldview saw order as divinely ordained. Just as God ruled heaven, the king ruled the realm, and the master ruled the household. To defy one's station was, in some eyes, to defy God himself. To discipline and punishment, the whip, the stock, and the shame life in service was not merely hard. It was policed. Misconduct could lead to severe and public punishment, designed not only to correct but to humiliate. Minor infractions, a dropped plate, a late arrival to the morning roll call might earn a scolding, a docking of wages, or a cuff across the ear. But more serious offenses, such as theft, drunkenness, or striking another servant, could see one whipped in front of the household, branded on the hand, or locked in the village stocks. Runaways faced the harshest fate. Under Tudor law, servants who absconded before their contracted term could be imprisoned, flogged, or even mutilated. The Statute of Artificers of 1563 bound many 2-year-long contracts, forbidding them to leave their employer without permission. The law gave masters extraordinary power. Servants were, in many respects, semi-bound laborers. One chronicler tells of a kitchen boy who, caught stealing scraps of beef, was paraded through the market with the stolen meat tied to his back before being beaten and returned to his master's service. The message was clear. Humiliation was as potent a deterrent as pain, yet punishment was not always fair. Favoritism, spite, or a master's foul mood could condemn a servant to undeserved suffering. For the powerless, justice was a privilege they could seldom afford. 3. Opportunity in chains. Rising through the ranks, and yet, for all the restrictions, service offered opportunities unavailable to many peasants bound to the land. A clever, hard-working servant could sometimes rise. Pages in great households, often boys from modest gentry families, might rise to positions of trust, becoming stewards, gentlemen ushers, or even confidants of powerful nobles. In the royal court, a servant who pleased the right patron could ascend dizzying heights. Thomas Wolsey, the son of a butcher, began as a servant in a noble household and ended as Cardinal and Lord Chancellor of England. For female servants, advancement was rarer but not impossible. A favored lady's maid might receive gifts, secure a good marriage, or be placed in service with an even greater household. Still, such prospects were slim. For every success story, countless others toiled their whole lives unseen, dying in obscurity. What made advancement possible? Luck, skill, and an unerring ability to read one's betters. The shrewd servant mastered the art of invisibility, being ever useful but never obtrusive, ever obedient but never sycophantic. It was a dangerous dance, but for those who could perform it, the rewards could be life-changing. For resistance in the shadows, the quiet rebellion, even in a world so tightly controlled, resistance existed. It had to. Servants developed subtle ways to push back against the harshness of their lot. There were the small rebellions, taking an extra hunk of bread from the kitchen, lingering over an errand to steal a moment of freedom, exchanging gossip in the laundry house despite prohibitions against idle chatter. There were also acts of sabotage. A disliked steward might find his boots mysteriously soiled, a cruel mistress's favorite gown ruined by accident. Songs and ballads mocked masters behind closed doors, creating a shared culture of defiance among the lower ranks. Sometimes, resistance turned open. Servant uprisings, though rare, did occur. In 1525, during the widespread unrest known as the Amicable Grant Revolt, many household servants joined their masters' tenants in open defiance of royal taxation. Discontent could be contagious. Religion, too, became a weapon. The Protestant Reformation and later Puritan movements gave servants new ideological tools to question their God-given place. Pamphlets circulated that declared all men equal before God, subtly undermining centuries of hierarchical thinking. 5. The price of defiance. But defiance carried immense risk. A servant who pushed too far could lose everything. Dismissal meant not just the loss of a job but of lodging, food, and protection. In a world where vagrancy was a crime, the unemployed servant faced prison or the gallows. Some disappeared into the growing cities, becoming beggars, thieves, or prostitutes. Others entered the ranks of the military, exchanging one form of servitude for another. Many simply withered away in poverty. And so, most rebellions remained small, quiet, and personal, a whispered joke, a stolen moment of rest. Survival demanded compromise, and compromise became a way of life. Conclusion: bound but not broken. Service in Tudor England was a paradox, a cage that sometimes served as a ladder, a prison that occasionally opened into a pathway of opportunity. Its discipline was brutal, but its structure provided stability in a chaotic world. Its opportunities were rare, but they existed. Above all, servants endured. They adapted, resisted in small ways, and carved meaning from lives that the elite often regarded as insignificant. Their chains were real, but within them, they found room if only a sliver to be human. Part 3. The human cost, love, loss, and the private lives of the servants. The life of a Tudor servant was not merely a story of labor, hierarchy, and discipline. Beneath the surface of unending toil lay the hidden emotional world of men and women who, despite their lack of power, sought connection, affection, and meaning in lives otherwise defined by service to others. This part delves into the intimate realm of Tudor servants, their friendships, romances, families, and griefs, and how the constant demands of servitude shaped, strained, and sometimes destroyed these human bonds. 1. The loneliness of service in Tudor England. Most servants entered service at a young age, often in their early teens, leaving behind the comfort and familiarity of their rural homes. For many, this transition was a profound rupture. Suddenly, they were thrust into households where they were strangers, expected to obey, unseen and unheard except when needed. Loneliness was a frequent companion. Letters from the period, though rare among servants, sometimes capture the ache of separation. One young maid in the service of a London merchant's wife wrote home in 1541, "I am not unwell, but my heart is heavy for want of my mother's counsel and my brother's jests." Such sentiments remind us that behind the facade of dutiful service, there were children longing for home, adults missing their spouses, and widows enduring isolation. Servants in great houses often slept in communal chambers, yet this did not always dispel solitude. Privacy was almost non-existent, but true companionship could be elusive. For every deep friendship formed among the staff, there were rivalries, jealousies, and mistrust born of competition for favor or fear of dismissal. Loneliness, paradoxically, could flourish even in crowded quarters. 2. Forbidden loves and secret liaisons. Despite the risks, love found its way into Tudor households. The proximity of young men and women working long hours together sometimes sparked romance. But such relationships were fraught with danger. Masters frowned upon servants marrying or even courting under their roof, fearing distractions from duty and the potential for scandal. Yet the human heart was not so easily governed. There are records of clandestine romances leading to hurried marriages, secret pregnancies, and, at times, tragic consequences. Parish court cases revealed maids brought before ecclesiastical authorities for bearing base-born children born out of wedlock, often fathered by fellow servants or, in more troubling cases, by their masters. One infamous 1560s case in Kent involved a kitchen maid impregnated by the son of her employer. When the pregnancy became visible, she was dismissed without wages and publicly shamed. The young man escaped censure entirely. Such stories were common. Women bore the brunt of moral judgment, while men, especially of higher status, often evaded responsibility. Still, there were happier outcomes. Some servants met their spouses in service and, once married, left together to establish modest households of their own. Marriage was both an escape and a new beginning. But for many, service kept them single well into adulthood. A life of unbroken labor left little time or freedom to nurture love. 3. The weight of grief. Loss was an unavoidable aspect of Tudor life, and servants were no exception to its relentless reach. Disease was a constant threat. Plague, sweating sickness, and other contagions swept through towns and households with grim regularity. Servants, often living in close quarters, were especially vulnerable. When a fellow servant died, grief was rarely given the space it deserved. Work went on. Kitchens still needed tending, chambers cleaning, fields plowing. Death among servants was often treated as a practical inconvenience, rather than a profound emotional event. Accounts from noble households sometimes mention payments to bury a servant or replace their clothing, but seldom do they note their passing with more than a terse line. Yet bonds among servants could be strong, and loss could leave lasting scars. A rare glimpse of such sentiment comes from a steward's letter in 1558, lamenting the death of a long-serving laundress. "She was with us these 15 years. And none in this house labored so diligently. I shall miss her laughter at Christmastide." These moments, though fleeting in the historical record, testify to the quiet human connections that endured despite a world of hierarchy and hardship. 4. Small joys and quiet rebellions. Despite the many hardships, Tudor servants were not devoid of joy. They found ways to carve out slivers of happiness amidst drudgery, singing while working, exchanging jokes, sneaking a dance in the kitchen after hours. Festivals and holidays, particularly Christmas and May Day, offered rare moments of respite when even masters might permit revelry. These occasions were more than simple amusements. They were acts of self-affirmation in lives otherwise dominated by obedience. To laugh, to love, to celebrate was, in a small way, to reclaim one's humanity. Even minor rebellions, lingering too long at market, pilfering a bit of extra food, whispering gossip in the hall, were expressions of individuality in a system designed to suppress it. 5. Faith, hope, and survival. For many Tudor servants, Faith offered solace. Whether Catholic or Protestant, religious observance provided meaning in lives of service. Churches were not just places of worship but also of community, where servants could briefly step out of their roles and exist as souls equal before God. Prayers for strength, for loved ones far away, for deliverance from disease and poverty, were whispered daily. Survival was the ultimate act of endurance. To persist through loneliness, to find love where possible, to mourn and then continue, required a quiet resilience. This resilience, though rarely celebrated in chronicles of kings and queens, was as vital to the fabric of Tudor society as any royal decree. Part 4. Legacies of Service. The echoes of Tudor servitude in modern times. The Tudor servant's world did not vanish with the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, though fashions changed, monarchs rose and fell, and England stumbled towards a new identity in the centuries to follow. The legacy of Tudor servitude persisted in ways subtle and profound. To examine the long shadow of this system is to better understand not only the roots of modern domestic labor, but also the enduring human dynamics of class, dependency, and dignity. 1. The inheritance of inequality. The Tudor era's rigid hierarchy left deep grooves in English society. While outright serfdom had disappeared by the 16th century, the Tudor household structure reinforced the belief that some people were naturally destined to serve, while others were born to command. This assumption bled into the Georgian and Victorian eras, manifesting in sprawling estates with armies of footmen, maids, and cooks. The Tudor Great House evolved into the Grand Country House. Yet the Tudor precedent was distinct in that servants were part of the family in a way later domestic workers were not. Living under the same roof as one's master blurred boundaries, creating intimacy and surveillance in equal measure. By the 18th and 19th centuries, servants were increasingly invisible, their quarters tucked into attics or basements. The Tudor model of paternalism, where masters were expected, however reluctantly, to care for their servants, gave way to a more commercial employer-employee relationship. Still, the echoes of Tudor servitude persisted in the expectation of obedience, the stigma attached to service, and the moral policing of workers' private lives. 2. From the manor to the modern home. Consider the language we still use today. Domestic service, maid, butler, and even the very notion of a household staff trace their conceptual roots to Tudor England. The hierarchical titles of chamberlain, steward, and groom may have shifted, but the underlying structure of domestic labor, one person tending to the needs of another's private life, remains a fundamental part of human societies. Modern domestic workers, from nannies to housekeepers, often face struggles eerily reminiscent of their Tudor predecessors: long hours, low pay, lack of privacy, and sometimes the requirement to live in their employer's home. While labor laws have improved conditions dramatically, the power imbalance remains. In a sense, the Tudor household can be seen as a prototype for the employer-employee relationship in private homes, a prototype that still influences cultural attitudes today. 3. Memory and myth. The servant in popular imagination. How do we remember Tudor servants? Too often, they are relegated to the margins of historical dramas: a silent maid scurrying across a candlelit corridor, a nameless groom holding a horse. The grandeur of Henry VIII's court or Elizabeth I's royal progresses obscures the toil that made such pageantry possible. Yet in recent decades, historical scholarship and popular culture have begun to resurrect these voices. Historians have combed through letters, court cases, and household accounts to reconstruct the daily lives of those who scrubbed the floors of Hampton Court or prepared lavish banquets for the Queen. Television shows like Wolf Hall and The Spanish Princess have attempted, however imperfectly, to show the perspectives of those below stairs. But even these efforts often romanticize servitude, presenting loyal retainers whose lives revolve entirely around their masters. The messy truth that servants loved, hated, schemed, and resisted remains less explored. For lessons in power and humanity, the study of Tudor servants forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to depend on another person as labor for your comfort? How does power warp human relationships? And how do people maintain dignity when their lives are not entirely their own? These questions resonate far beyond Tudor England. In our modern world of service economies, where millions work in industries catering to others' needs, hospitality, retail, care work, the dynamics of dependency and inequality are alive and well. The Tudor servant's experience, with its mix of exploitation and opportunity, humiliation and agency, foreshadows the struggles of contemporary workers seeking respect in a system that often undervalues them. 5. The quiet revolutions of the past. It is tempting to view Tudor servants solely as victims of a rigid system, but doing so erases their resilience and contribution to social change. Their small acts of resistance, running away from abusive masters, joining city guilds, saving wages to start independent lives, gradually eroded the old order. As England urbanized and markets expanded, servants became consumers and citizens, helping to shape the very society that once confined them. In this sense, the legacy of Tudor servitude is not just one of oppression but of transformation. The structures of service they endured became the scaffolding upon which modern labor rights were eventually built. Without their struggles, both silent and outspoken, the world we inhabit today would be very different. Conclusion. Shadows that still linger to walk through the reconstructed kitchens of Hampton Court, or the great halls of Hardwick houses to stand on ground soaked in centuries of labor, the stones whisper of chamber pots carried, floors scrubbed, bread baked, and tears shed in silence. Though the faces of Tudor servants have largely faded from memory, their lives shaped the world we inherited. In remembering them, we are reminded that history is not just made by kings and queens, but by the countless hands that made their reigns possible. And perhaps, in acknowledging their humanity, we can begin to see the humanity in those who serve us today, not as invisible helpers, but as people with stories of their own.